Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 6 of our class on West European Jewish history before Hitler. Our topic this week, as you know, is intellectual and cultural responses to modernity. And in particular, we're going to be looking at the Haskalah, the salons, on which we've already spent quite a bit of time through Rachel Varnhagen, the Wissenschaft movement, or the study of Judaism in a socio-scientific way. And I want to add a little bit on the topic of Jewish art, which develops during this period. I know it's not in your literature, but it actually is a topic that I personally have been exploring, and I think literally illustrates well much of what is going on during this complicated moment in Jewish history. We're mostly looking at Germany between, let's say, 1780 at the earliest, and about 1850, even 1871, because of the reunification of Germany at that point. I've written down the reading assignments for this week that you can check online. Again, if anyone has problems because of different editions of Mendes Fleur, just be in touch and we'll make sure we're all on the same page. In chapter 6 of Mendes Fleur, I am recommending an optional reading, but I think it will be very beneficial given our discussion of last week on Varnhagen. 3 documents in section 6. The section itself is on Jewish identity during the period we're talking about. Reading number 3 by Kafka, number 6 by Heinrich Heine, 7 by Ludwig Born, and 8 by our kind of miserable friend Rachel Varnhagen. So if you want to read those, I think they will help further clarify the issue. I don't think they're going to make anybody any happier, but I think it will give us a more realistic view of what is going on. Now, we begin the main discussion today on the topic of the Haskalah. The word Haskalah is a Hebrew term. It comes from the root term sechel, which means reason, reasonable. And Haskalah means the period of reasoning, which would be parallel to enlightenment. In Europe, there is a broad enlightenment. It's centered in France, but it also occurs in England and Scotland, in Germany. There is an echo of it, an important echo of it here in the United States. The German Haskalah is a little bit warmer toward issues of the spirit than let's say in France, where you have the dominant figure of Voltaire, who is quite anti-religious. In America, you might have somebody like a Thomas Paine, who was close in spirit to Voltaire, and actually that will cost him dearly after the American Revolution, when the French Revolution becomes quite excessive. So you have a general enlightenment in Germany, which is referred to as the Aufklärung. And at the center of the Aufklärung in Berlin, in Prussia, is a playwright, philosopher, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing. Lessing is a devotee of reason, and he believes that reason is universal. It's a universal function. It's inherent in the human being, that the structure of the universe is such that human reason and almost the metaphysics of the universe are all in alignment with one another. And he speculates, because of the particular historical, cultural situation in Germany and the long history of anti-Semitism there, that it is possible for a Jew to be a rational creature. And the critics immediately say to him, well, show us one. All Jews are ghetto creatures and rather despicable, if not ugly, and they're not educable. And Lessing, like others in England, say, no, it's not true. There is such a thing as a reasonable Jew. He then learns of a young Jewish philosopher by the name of Moses Mendelssohn, who comes from a town outside of Berlin, Dessau, and has gravitated to the Prussian capital because of his rabbi has been called there, and he ingratiates himself to well-to-do families, becomes a tutor, begins to read in European literature, and very quickly emerges as a major intellectual force. The two men meet, and Lessing opens the door to Mendelssohn to be his example of a rational Jew, and in fact a major philosopher in the German Enlightenment, with particular interest in questions regarding aesthetics. Well, it so happens that a Swiss theologian then challenges Mendelssohn and says to him that if you're so reasonable, why aren't you Christian? Because Christianity is not only the religion of faith, it is also the religion of reason. And Mendelssohn will defend his Judaism in an interesting fashion. There is not 100% scholarly agreement on this, but the usual way of looking at Mendelssohn's philosophy is that it's bifurcated. That is, it comes in two parts. Mendelssohn argues that the, let's call it doctrinal part of Judaism, is all based on reason and can be discerned by reason, and is the most reasonable of all religions, and therefore he can remain part of it. On the other hand, he argued that God gave the Jews through Moses a specific revelation, the Torah, for the ceremonial law. And in that fashion, he puts together a philosophy of Judaism in which it is both philosophically rooted and an obligation to the Jews from on high. It is not a solution to the ultimate problem that Jews and Judaism face in Germany, but it does present a paradigm of how to be, quote, both a universal man, a citizen, and at the same time be a Jew loyal to the ancient covenant. A circle of Jewish intellectuals and leaders gather around Mendelssohn, and they collectively become the Haskalah. He has many tenets to his program. Following his pattern, he wants Jews to become part of general society, and therefore urges them to learn to speak German, which he does through his Bible translation, which is printed, by the way, in Hebrew letters, as I think I've shared with you before. He also writes a commentary in Hebrew called the Biur, which becomes the basis for the creation of modern Hebrew literature, and then after that, the revival of Hebrew as a spoken language by Eliezer ben Yehuda many decades later. The Haskalah takes on a life of its own. There is a journal called Hamasef. The different people who take the lead, David Friedlander, who's a kind of a court Jew, will even offer conversion, mass conversion, and thereby lose his leadership credentials with the masses of Jews. Saul Asher is mentioned in our book, who writes a book called Leviathan, I guess following Hobbes, in which he argues for religious reform even before there is a reform movement in Judaism, a topic we'll get to next week. The Haskalah in Germany becomes increasingly German in its orientation, but when it spreads to the east into Tsarist Russia, it takes on all types of different colorations. There is a continuation of the Hebrew language Haskalah. There is a development of a Yiddish Haskalah later, a Russian Haskalah, and as it moves further south, even a Ladino Haskalah, in which modernity and aspects of Jewish culture and religion are retained as a pattern. So it is a prelude to other adjustments. The essence of the Haskalah being that it is possible to be intellectually European and still retain a Jewish identity. Now, the Haskalah is founded in the principles of the Enlightenment in general, which means it relies on reason. But Europe in general does not stay with the Enlightenment. There is a reaction, a political reaction and cultural reaction following Napoleon, and Europe turns in the direction of what is called Romanticism, which does not look at reason, but rather looks at emotion. The Enlightenment is about light. The Romanticism is about the night as opposed to the light, and it looks at a very different aspect of the human being. It speculates, for example, on not whether or not there are universals like reason, but whether or not each people, each folk has its own essence. And we'll then ask the question, is the German essence and the Jewish essence compatible with one another? One very tragic answer to that, of course, is Nazi ideology and the genocide of the Jews at the hands of the Nazis and their supporters. This is a period also in which there is a political reversal of fortune following the defeat of Napoleon, and some of the legal gains Jews had made also are reversed in the post-Napoleonic period, often referred to as the Age of Metternich, following the lead of the great Austrian counselor, Count Metternich. And so the Jews find themselves in a rather precarious position. They had tasted a little bit of freedom, and now were pulled back and are kind of caught in a no man's land between the promise of the new and the problems of the past. And this no man's land that they're in is a very difficult place to occupy, both culturally and psychologically. And it's in that context that we have the salons. And interestingly, it's mostly Jewish women who are involved in this. The men are in somewhat traditional roles, but modern activities out there with their businesses, and the women become highly interested in culture and begin to bring in contemporary Jewish culture into their homes, into their talking circles, etc. And as we know, have trouble holding on to their Jewishness, that they view it as a kind of punishment and a burden, and are looking for ways to reconcile themselves with prevailing notions of romanticism and take on new identities. The fact of the matter is, German anti-Semitism is so persistent that the whole thing just ends up making them miserable, and this will continue as a characteristic of Jewish life in Western Europe and Central Europe, all the way up to the time of the Holocaust. This change of exile in the Jewish experience, from the exile from ancient Israel to a kind of personal exile without a national context, in which one feels lost and punished. And as many of you have picked up, it really is a remarkably difficult circumstance. And in that sense, I guess you could say that Rachel Varnhagen and Hannah Arendt are bookends, one at the beginning of this process and one at the end of this process. Ultimately, what will be needed to resolve this will be some kind of religious reform in which a different kind of Judaism can be constructed, which will allow people, somewhat along Mendelssohnian lines, but with greater possibilities of liturgical adjustment and thematic adjustments within the liturgy, since Mendelssohn really didn't permit any of them, so that there could be a way of creating a synthesis of Judentum, Jewishness, Judaism, and Deutschtum, the German way. The Reform movement needed a methodology because ultimately it did not want to be simply a dermatological change, but it wanted to be a deep change in Judaism. So it needed a mechanism by which it could come to understand the Jewish past and the Jewish heritage. Those tools were provided by a small intellectual movement, which in German is called Wissenschaft des Judentums. Wissenschaft des Judentums means the scientific study of Judaism. And there's an old joke out there about Gershom Scholem, who's the real founder of the modern Wissenschaftlich study of Jewish mysticism, of Kabbalah, that he was greatly criticized for studying Kabbalah because it was superstition and even just plain old nonsense. And his famous quip was, you're right that Kabbalah is nonsense. But the study of nonsense, the Wissenschaft of nonsense, that is science. And so he proceeded. Within the world of Wissenschaft, you had people who wanted to use it as a way to integrate the Jews. There were people who viewed Wissenschaft as a purely objective, academic kind of exercise. There were those who wanted to use it toward religious modification, those who wanted toward cultural modification. And if you take a look at the readings, the first 10 readings in chapter 5 of Mendes Fleur, you will see how Wissenschaft was used variously by the different scholars and intellectuals in the movement. It's important to point out that Wissenschaft stands in direct contrast to traditional yeshiva study of Talmud and Jewish texts, in which there is an assumption of the divinity and the authority of the text. In Wissenschaft, the literature of Judaism is human. For the most part, there are some more traditional ones, but generally speaking, it's viewed as a human product that can be studied over time, that evolves, that it develops, that it's complex, that it reflects circumstances of the day. And this is really revolutionary in terms of how Jews can begin to understand their past. It is a serious challenge to Jewish religious traditionalism. It's an opening for those who would like to modify Jewish practice. They can say, look, X, Y, and Z are kind of new, or they're not part of the essential argument. Wissenschaft could be used to demonstrate that the Jewish folk is every bit as much as noble as the German folk or the Frankish folk or whomever. Perhaps the most important name among the Wissenschaft scholars is Leopold Zunz, Z-U-N-Z, who's a great historian of the Jewish people. He and others around them ultimately will become the faculty of some of the emerging modern seminaries, as opposed to the traditional yeshivas. These individuals, all men initially, were university trained with PhDs, and the German PhD is quite an intellectual accomplishment. However, the German universities did not allow Wissenschaft des Judentums. They did not allow the scientific study of Judaism as part of their endeavors, and therefore these people like Zunz and others were forced to the outside. And they had to either maintain intellectual societies or create Jewish institutions, but the universities themselves would not allow them. And this goes on for a very long time, even in this country, so that initially you get rabbinic seminaries and Hebrew colleges, let's say like we have here in Philadelphia, Gratz College, and Dropsy College, which is for advanced Jewish, used to be for advanced Jewish studies, because that was the only place you could go to get a PhD in Jewish studies. The universities simply would not allow them. It's not until after World War I that Columbia and Harvard allow Wissenschaft to be taught within the university. Today, that approach is what's called Jewish Studies. The class that we are all participating in together is a form of modern-day Wissenschaft. It probably has a very different set of ideological and cultural assumptions, but it is modern, it is empirical, it is rational, it follows the methodologies of history and sociology and anthropology. It is rooted in the modern university, although it is still somewhat problematic in the sense that where do you put a Jewish studies program? Do you put it in religion? Do you put it in history? Do you make it an interdisciplinary program? Is it a part of a language? Do you keep Hebrew and Yiddish within Jewish studies, or do you assign them to other departments? There's still an issue on funding. Interestingly, that universities tend to ask Jewish programs to self-sustain, in addition to their students, raise money from the community. This is a point that Jacob Neusner had raised many years ago, so that even today, with Jewish studies in America being taught in 400 different colleges and universities, and Jewish studies thriving in other parts of the world, in Israel, at Hebrew University in Tel Aviv, it's remarkable. In Germany today, the Wissenschaft is very, very strong. In a number of universities at Duisburg, in München and Munich and other places, there are wonderful young scholars who are following the footsteps of Leopold Sunz and Jost and Abraham Geiger and others. And finally, now we've passed the 20-minute mark. I just want to mention the development of Jewish art, also during this period following the defeat of Napoleon. Judaism historically had an ambivalent attitude toward art, and mostly used it, almost entirely used it, for the illustration of its religious life. There were many different types of forbidden images. The strictest, of course, was a prohibition on the image of God. At most, you would get kind of the little finger, like at the end of a pointer to reading the Torah. You also see that in manuscripts. But other than that, God is incorporeal. And there were real questions that we don't have time to go into here about how much a human being can be represented artistically, and other things like that, issues of modesty, and on it goes. But in the period after the defeat of Napoleon, with the rise of romantic pictures, including an interest in illustrating the past, in which there had been no cameras or painters to do contemporaneous work, Jewish history painters do begin to emerge, and their genre of art in Germany in particular is the prevailing form of Romanticism. Many of them made their living by being portrait artists. One in particular, Moritz Daniel Oppenheim, is the portrait painter for the fabulous Rothschild family, which enables him to then go and explore other subjects in Jewish art. And I want to alert you to two paintings in particular. The first one is of Moses Mendelssohn playing chess with Lavatar, his theological nemesis, being watched by Lessing dressed in blue silk. There are all types of signs and symbols that are built into this painting. It's quite iconic. And the other is his 1834 picture of the return of the Jewish volunteer. That is a military soldier who comes back to his traditional Jewish family. That picture in particular caused a huge stir in Central Europe. It was one of the favorite pictures of the Habsburg emperor, and got a lot of play in a very positive way, because ultimately what it shows the possibility of a Jewish person emerging from the embrace of family to be a good and loyal soldier of the empire, and fitting into society, even though his roots might be different than that of a German burgher or even a German peasant. So you have this attempt through art to kind of reframe the way Jews could look in German-speaking society as well. So this is a very rich period. It is filled with intellectuals and artists. It's filled with angst, and it has to do with the difficulty of adjusting from being completely external to society to trying to find a way into society during a period in which at both the lower levels of society because of traditional anti-Semitism and the higher levels of society because of Romanticism, it's just very difficult for Jews to make their way in. And the question becomes, what can they adjust in their Jewishness and in their Judaism to make that possible? One of the answers that they will come up with is religious reform, that we will look at next week, and then further down the line, the decision that they're never going to fit in at all, and therefore have to form their own nation and ultimately nation state, which is the form of which takes the form of Zionism. As we know, others become interested in socialism and those causes, and yet others become quite bourgeois and believe that a cosmopolitan middle class Europe is the answer to the condition of the Jews. I look forward to your reaction to the readings online and the wonderful play among you in terms of comments and on-the-spot research. And have a good week, and I look forward to reading your materials. Take care.